Okay, so hi and welcome to everybody who's joining us today. My name is Meg. I'm from Power to Fly. I am a delivery and marketing specialist with Power to Fly. I'm going to be your host today. For anybody who hasn't joined us before, or let's say you haven't joined us in a while, we do have a couple quick housekeeping things I'll go over, and I don't want to waste any time doing them. So if you have questions, throw them up in the chat and I'll be happy to answer. So as far as housekeeping, the whole goal of today is participation. It's all for you, our community members that joined us today. So feel free to turn your cameras on. You don't have to if you don't want to, no pressure. You're more than welcome to come off mute and ask questions. We absolutely encourage it. The only thing I'll say is, especially with lag times and that kind of thing, we try not to talk over each other. Do your best. I know everybody's trying here. And if you prefer to not come off mute and ask questions, you can always put them into the Zoom chat. If you want your question asked anonymously, send it to me privately. You can find me on the drop-down menu instead of sending it to everyone, and I'll make sure that your question is asked anonymously for whatever reason. So today's session is being recorded, so don't feel like you have to take feverish notes or anything. You can always go back and rewatch it. Everybody who is registered, whether you're attending or not, will get an email with a link to the rewatch once the video is posted on our site. It usually takes about 1 to 2 days. And that email will also contain a survey. We very, very, very much appreciate it if you guys take these surveys. It takes max 2 minutes, and it helps us make changes to these chat and learns so that you get as much out of it as we put into it. I want to make sure that you guys have as much fun today and learn as much as I'm about to. And so that way we can, kind of hear back from our community and make sure that we're making changes that you guys need. Let's see, last thing. Oh, I'll introduce our speaker here in a moment, but once we've introduced her, there's also a slide with all the questions that you guys have pre-submitted. So I'll hold on those those pages. There's 2 pages of them in the slide deck. You can take a screenshot so that way you can see what questions are coming up next. That'll help you know if maybe your question is already going to be asked, or if you have something like a follow-up you'd like to ask a question, whatever. I think that's all I've got. So without further ado, we are going to introduce Bella Karit. So Bella started her career as a software engineer and held various leadership positions in software development organizations for the past 15 years. She led successful software delivery of critical and complex programs, establishing collaborative, cross-functional relationships and teams across technologies and cultures. Bella holds a bachelor's in science degree in mathematics from Hebrew University in Jerusalem and is a Bentley University MBA candidate for spring 2020. So welcome today, Bella, I'm sorry. Welcome today, Bella. So I will be going on mute anytime I'm not speaking. I recommend everybody else do the same. We're not listening to dog snores the whole time. But Bella, is there anything else you'd like to add to that introduction?
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Meg. That was great. So let's move on to the questions.
Perfect. And then one last thing before we hit the questions. Don't forget, you can follow Waters Corporation on Power to Fly. I'm going to put the link to their page on Power to Fly in the group chat, so you can go navigate there if you'd like. You can check out their open roles there, and you can also follow them. And just as a reminder, in case you don't know, following companies on Power to Fly alerts you when they have new roles that are posted. It also puts you on something called a followers network. So hiring managers at Waters or various companies that are partnered with Power to Fly can see that list, and when they go to source for new roles, that's one of the first places we check. So because that tells the hiring manager that you're somebody that's already interested in that company. So it makes you, kind of helps you be a little bit more visible to hiring managers. So I'll put that link in the chat. And here is the first slide of your questions. There's 2 pages of these, so feel free to grab a screenshot here if you'd like. And here is the link to the Waters Corporation on Power to Fly. So we're going to go to the next page right now. And this is our page 2 of questions, so feel free to grab a screenshot if you'd like. If not, again, no worries. Nobody's expecting you to take notes on this. All right. All right, so we're going to start us off with our first question. Bella, how did you get your start in technology?
All right. So first of all, I wanted to thank everyone that joined us today. So I understand that now is sort of an odd time for everyone to be. I'm guessing most of you are working remotely today and for the next weeks or so. So I appreciate that everybody could focus on that and submitting all those great questions. So, so I'll start with this one. How did you get your start in technology? So that's a great and interesting question. So I actually took some programming classes while I was in the middle school, and I went to my undergraduate degree is in mathematics. I was not quite sure what 100% where my degree was going to take me as far as my career. In the late 90s, though, the job market was really great for software development. So that's when I graduated. I thought I would take a small break before going to graduate school. And a friend of mine that I went to school with mentioned that they had a very short contract in the startup company where he worked at. And I joined for 3 weeks and I stayed there for 2.5 years. This was sort of a great place to start with a startup that was almost like a consulting business, and they sold different software applications to the market in Japan by sort of making internationalized software, different varieties of applications and technologies, which was really good for me. As far as my undergraduate degree, I took a lot of computer science classes for the theory of computer science. I didn't do a lot of development, so that was sort of a great hands-on introduction into the world of technology. And that was it. That was the start. So
very cool.
Yeah.
So this person wants to know, they're saying, I'm transitioning to a career in tech from a different field. What advice do you have for gaining trust and collaborating effectively?
So first of all, that sounds great. So that's awesome. So any transitioning of a career is, it could be challenging, it could be exciting. I think transitioning to a career in tech is an awesome thing to do. And it's not very simple. I think I appreciate the question about gaining trust and collaboration. And I think I understand what's prompting that. I think it's very important to sort of, first of all, trust doesn't happen on day one. It's sort of something to, I think, to expect to take a little bit of time, even if you were just a new person that did not just start a career in tech. If you sort of were to join a team, you sort of have to establish those relationships. So give the expectation to yourself that it will take a little bit of time to sort of, gain confidence and trust of those that work with you. Don't hesitate to ask questions, ask a lot of questions. I think it's, sometimes we think that asking questions is sort of, it makes us more vulnerable to people to show what we don't know. I think being transparent and sort of setting very clear expectations, what you know, what you don't know, asking questions when you're not sure about something is extremely important. I also think that in some ways, I would say that it might give you an advantage as to sometimes when you are considered an expert or considered a person that has a lot of experience in a certain field, you're sort of thinking, is it okay to ask this question? Are other people going to think sort of less of me that I don't know it, even though I'm expected to know this? I think sort of playing a card that I'm new here is sort of could be to your advantage. I have an example of a colleague with whom I worked with that in one of my previous jobs that for as long as I knew her and I worked with her for 15 years, she would start a sentence with, I'm not really technical, so I'm going to ask this question. And at some point I always wanted to challenge her to tell her, I think by now you probably know this, but I understand why you're asking this in this setting. So so I think just give yourself some time, be open to everyone that you work with what you know and you don't know, and I think you'll do great.
So just speaking from a personal curiosity here, would you say that there's a line there that you want to be careful of when you are, how do I put this? You don't want to pretend to not know things that you know, right? But you're trying to build a rapport with people.
100%. But
Okay.
I think though, if you were concerned to ask questions because you were thinking that you were expected to know certain things, I think if you were concerned about this, I think sort of being transparent with it, saying, I'm new to this industry, I don't know much about it. You know, I think if you were concerned to how people perceive you, I think that that might be playing to your advantage. So absolutely, I'm not sort of saying pretend we don't know something, but I think well, you do, but I think that being new somewhere could be, you know, could be to your benefit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. All right, so this next question is, what do you think is the biggest challenge when connecting different groups together? How do you create common ground?
Yeah, so that's also that's a very interesting question as well. So so I think a lot of times the personalities could be challenging, and I think at times a lot of people, and I think we have a question on that topic later on. You know, sometimes the voices that are being heard are the voices that maybe are more loud, and there are some people with perhaps valuable opinions that feel that they cannot speak up or not being heard. So I think a lot of times it is extremely important to have a very good moderator for bringing the different groups together, and a good moderator or facilitator of the conversations can make a lot of difference, especially if they're sort of perceived, not to imply there might be conflict, but that could be perceived as neutral to sort of the interests of those different groups, or the person that maybe is well respected by sort of those different groups. I sort of had some notes here with, you know, with my thoughts when I was thinking about this. You know, sometimes, you know, because I would like to unpack this a little bit, because when we're talking about different groups, it could be different groups within the same organization. So let's say, or same group or different groups across organizations. Sometimes the challenges could be different. And so to give you an example, and I'm assuming that a lot of folks are from software development companies here. So for example, if we're talking to connecting the groups across organizations, so you know, one example that I had in mind would be we could have customer support, software engineering, and product management, and they could have one high-level goal that is the same, but how they interpret their goal and achieving that goal could be very different. And so how do we connect them? Folks that, you know, in support and services that might be interested in satisfying the customer needs, very short-term. Product management is thinking maybe longer term, and engineering is sort of in the middle trying to satisfy everyone. And how do we make all those, you know, groups aligned and sort of moving in the right direction? So, you know, I think it's very important to, you know, in finding this common ground is to sort of have the conversation across and figure out what's more important to the whole group, prioritize, and once that's aligned, I think then the conversations are probably easier. Another thing, you know, do those different groups understand their the dependencies that they might have between them? You know, and one example that I thought of would be, you know, for engineering groups, you know, oftentimes, depending on how your processes work, but oftentimes engineering is followed by some sort of testing that is done by maybe a separate group that is doing integration or performance tests or something like that before software is sort of released and deployed and available to the customers. And, you know, sometimes those groups who are working together, or even engineering groups that work on different components, don't necessarily well understand how one is dependent on another, and what one, what it means for the group that is sort of down the pipeline if one gets delayed, and so how it impacts the whole universe. And so I think it's very important to find this common language and to sort of be respectful to whatever their concerns and their perceptions of the risks are, because what I think is not a big deal might be really a big deal for somebody else that I, not necessarily work day to day, but they are impacted by what I do. So does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So to kind of summarize, kind of get more of a holistic view of how these different teams or these different departments are going to work together, but also how different situations might impact somebody that is either part of the conversation now or might not be part of the conversation right now. That way you can kind of do a high level troubleshoot of let's keep this in mind while we're making changes.
Yeah, and when we see that something that we perhaps committed to before, if we're seeing that we have any changes, if something changes, who are our stakeholders? Can we give it a little more thought? Let's make sure that everyone is informed. Let's be transparent about this, and I think that always helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to circle back to the earlier question, we had a really good point that came in anonymously, which is that most people in tech love to explain tech to new people as long as they realize that you are open and listen well.
There you go. Listening.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And honestly, I mean, in my personal experience, I've had a lot of good response from being open about the questions that I wanted to ask, like being upfront about, hey, here's where my understanding level is, but I'm unclear on this section of whatever it was you're talking about. And then honestly, even if they start to veer into stuff that you already understand, it can be helpful to not like interrupt and be like, oh, hey, well, I already know that. If you let somebody explain it to you, not only are you reinforcing your knowledge, but then you can also say, oh yeah, I was aware of that because blah, blah, blah. And then it kind of keeps the conversation flowing and makes them understand that you're not going to cut them off just because you think you already know what's going on.
Exactly. I think be prepared to listen. I think that's point number one.
Yeah, absolutely. Most people, I mean, generally speaking, from my customer service, years of a customer service experience, people just want to be listened to. All right, so moving us along to our next question. This person says, our organization is just getting started with what I think will soon become a mainstream remote work team. Looking for any resources about how our org gets started, measuring productivity, proper escalation, and access to the right information, people, resources at the right time. So if you are just building this mainstream remote work team, where do you start?
Yeah, I think it's actually quite a big topic. I'm very happy that to have this. We can talk about that for an hour. Yeah, so I think I guess first thing is to make sure that you are, or one of the important things is make sure that you are tooled properly, and the tools that you are using are going to be easy to use for collaboration. That's important for both remote and not remote work. So some of the examples that I have from the top of my head is, for example, the Atlassian collaborative tool. So that's what we use, at Honors, for example, and that's what I've used in the past 5, 6, 7 years. They're great. So Confluence, any other tools for shared content management, such as Office 365 with SharePoint, or even Google sort of based collaboration tools. That all works great. So it's very important to have that in place, along with the tooling such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams or WebEx or whatever else we have for video calls, for meetings, for instant messages. So those are must-haves. As far as organizing the teams, measuring productivities, proper escalations. So that's for example, organizing content is not. It's actually not a simple task. A lot of times we have a lot of information. So for example, either it could be Confluence, it could be SharePoint. A lot of times there is a lot of information. A lot of times it's sort of, we start looking for something, we cannot find it, or we find too many things and it's sort of difficult to produce. So organization of the content is very important. So it's important to give it a thought, especially for, when the teams are remote. From the, what I found helpful in the past is when there is some consistency in the way the teams sort of name their spaces on Confluence, let's say, and let's say on Teams, and let's say email distribution. So that sort of helps to get organized when sort of from the top of my team I know, oh, if that team is that named in Jira, then that's how I look for them in Outlook or on Confluence or on Slack or Microsoft Teams. So sort of some consistency helps. So if there was some convention within an organization, I think it would be helpful for people not knowing exactly the name. It makes it easier for them to look. Again, any convention for the naming of the documents, for labeling, for tagging, hashtagging, I think it all helps with searches. From the access to the right people. So again, depending on the size of the organization, that could be a big issue. And I know this for a fact because I have experienced it quite a bit. So if the teams have, sort of the teams, so I would recommend for every team to have sort of a site, whether or not it's SharePoint or Confluence or any other tools sort of your group decides to use, for everyone to have the team site and to have the information on team site that would be maybe a landing page or something that is like easily visible and have a link from it with who is on the team, the roles, if the team is sort of a service team in any way, if it's if you anticipate that a lot of interactions with the folks outside the teams, either within R&D or outside of the R&D, if there are any escalation procedures, have them right there. Have the processes documented and accessible, publish them, and again, publish them in various places on the intranet where sort of maybe some might look for the updates from the team and on the sort of Teams pages. Another helpful sort of, especially for any escalations, another helpful tip is to have a group email address. So sometimes, and I think that's also quite common when we have subject matter experts that everyone goes with questions to. We kind of want to make sure that everybody not asks the same person all the time, that there is some knowledge transfer, or maybe others on the teams can help with that. Establish a group email, maybe establish some rotation. So if folks outside the team, if for example, by the escalations we mean some questions from the field, establish some rotation, so the team members would alternate with who sort of is monitoring and watching out for those emails to come in, or if somebody is on vacation or is sick, the group sort of receives the email and the questions are not sort of slip through the cracks. Establish, so that's helpful. If there are any alerts that are related to the escalations, for example, the tickets get created for the teams, maybe there are tickets from the customers, maybe there are tickets from QA, or maybe the team is distributed. So you have, maybe testers are on different time zones. So if the team comes in the morning, so they need to be alerted right away. And not always there is an option to talk if they're too far in the time zones. Have some reports or events created that notify the team in a way that they will not be missed. And I say that because sometimes we have so many email notifications and alerts. If the folks here use Jira, so sometimes you subscribe to be a watcher on certain projects, you're flooded. It's almost like spam, like all the notifications that we get from all those tools. So if there's a certain alert that you don't want to be lost in the flood of those alerts, either create a certain report that it would be pulling the data in real time, and you're going to be watching it regularly, either somebody designated by the team or as a team. It could be Jira dashboard, or it could be any other report if you're using a different tool. Sometimes what I found useful is there were certain alerts from the application that I knew I could not miss. That was for disabling certain features in one of the roles that I had in the past. So for them specifically, I had an integrated alert from the Outlook into the Slack. I had a special Slack channel, so they would pop up and I would have a special alert notified. So they were not very frequent. It was definitely everything needs to drop and this needs to be taken care of. So just make sure that the team sort of has those identified and be sort of mindful what's the most important that you can't miss. So that would be my tip for the escalation, especially for different time zones if they're involved. Also, what's really, really important is for remote work team is onboarding and training and cross-training and peer reviews. So that could be more difficult just because people are sort of not necessarily physically in the same location. So to make sure that the knowledge is transferred, that everyone feels that they sort of belong with the team, that there is a team, I think that's super important. Similarly, I think what you need to do is similar to what you would do if the team was co-located, but you have to sort of put more effort into that to some degree, whereas, when we think about it, if we have a team that is not remote, that works all together, and we had a new person, how do we onboard them? So I would always say, well, have a buddy system, have a more senior person if you have a more junior person join to sort of review their work, to help them out if they have questions, et cetera, et cetera. So if suddenly we have a new person that is not there, so then everybody has to sort of make an effort. We have to schedule the time daily to talk to for the folks to talk together. We kind of have to say specifically, the changes that you do, and that, your processes might take care of that. But for example, for the peer reviews, say, this is the group that always sort of reviews your work even before sort of you move it forward downstream. I would suggest to, if there are any sort of escalation processes, which I'm sure there would be, or any processes, make sure they're documented, so they can be accessed by anyone and easily found by everyone. So, because then the tasks for, cross-training, they become just easier and more streamlined.
I mean, I feel the same way. We have the same kind of situation when I first started working here, where it was like, people act like onboarding is such a big, big problem when you have distributed teams, but really, I mean, it's basically the same as onboarding a person in office. You just have to actually have the documentation in place that most people are like, oh, well, we don't need that because you can sit next to Janice and learn from her. It's like, well, you need that actual documentation in place so that way people know where to go.
Yeah, and and that's interesting that you were sort of mentioning that. So that's exactly right. And sometimes when we talk about remote teams, suddenly there is another team elsewhere. So suddenly you're onboarding not a person, you are onboarding a group of people, and just to do this on a scale becomes even more difficult. And to your point, Meg, instead of sitting next to somebody, you sort of have to convey what you do day in and day out. And this is exactly what I actually, now a year ago, I had to onboard somebody that was joining us in a different geographical location. And so we literally, that's what I did. I sat down and I put notes, and this is actually very difficult to do because we sort of go about doing what we're doing, we just know what we do. I had to write down what I do for every single thing that I do, and that was hard. It's not, once you sort of start writing it down, you look at this and you're like, wow, that's actually a lot of stuff. I didn't realize that I had to call literally 35 people to to do this one task, and then each of those people, I expect to certain output from them, and then sort of synthesize it and do something else with it. Once you start writing those down, that sort of then the processes become, even though obviously you would not be documenting every single move that you do, but that sort of highlights some of the things that are more important or less important. And as I wrote things down, I said, okay, we're going to start with this piece, and that makes sort of setting the expectations for others, and is very helpful as well.
No, absolutely. I mean, we're big on, I don't know about your organizations, but we're really big on training videos. Mm-hmm. So we'll screen share, and like I'll walk, a coworker or a new employee or something like through whatever process I'm doing. But we're big on training videos in partnership with some kind of doc that will, give you the high points, but that way we don't have to create these really comprehensive documentation packages that include screenshots or include this or because those are the kind of things that, like, it's nice and it seems like a great accomplishment until something changes. Yeah. So kind of working two-pronged attack, we're a little bit better able to adjust when things change.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and that's interesting that it's sort of just in time. It's just in time for me. One of the teams that I manage is a brand new team. We have new hires on that team. We have some folks from different parts of the organization that we put on that team to work on a brand new product. And we literally just formed that team a couple weeks ago. And as we go through some training and some overviews, that's exactly what we have been doing. We have been recording the videos. And this week we have a new team member starting. The first thing that we have done was sharing those videos with him from the last week, and that was amazingly convenient. So.
Plus, I mean, personally, I enjoy like watching the videos, and when I was onboarding still, I would, I kept it all in like a Microsoft OneNote doc because that was, the program was already on my computer. But once we got, it also depends on, your security procedures and that kind of thing, but we live and die by Google Docs. And so I was able to kind of take notes as I was watching these videos and then add in like, like a hyperlink to the doc where I find all of the passwords that I need, or to the doc that's got the rest of the, drilled out information and instructions. So that way I can take notes and be quick, but know that like if I need to navigate back to the more comprehensive instructions, I know how to get myself there. I also love what you're talking about with the kind of proper escalation. I mean, even it sounds really, really old school, but like we have ours built out almost like a phone tree where it's like, here's the person you go to for this subject. If they're not available, you can escalate this. Plus, I don't know about you.
And they ask us, so that's actually a very important topic. So if there are processes that sort of could require escalation, especially if there is sort of an urgent type of situations, and I would imagine with customer issues, there's always something that sort of could be escalated potentially. So make those procedures. So first of all, it's good to have it documented. Second of all, make them known to the teams that you expect the escalation from. It's in everybody's best interest to make sure that those procedures are rolled out, that everybody knows how and where to find them. So, the rollout of, especially if it's something that is just getting established. So it's very, very important to work with others that, there is a new team that needs, if the escalation changes and now there is a new team that is remote, that, the questions need to be routed to that team. Make sure that you work with the folks that, perhaps escalated to you previously, or, inform them of the change. Make sure that there is some brief period of time in which people are going to be confused and not do things right. So, everybody needs to be a little bit patient. And also publishing sort of the proper escalation channels with the ways to reach folks, and so that information gets updated is also very important. There are tools that maybe there are tools that do that. So, especially for folks that are for SaaS, for host software solutions that need to be available 24 hours, there are tools where you set up your team to be on call and folks get, reminders and notifications. So it's very, very important to have set up if you anticipate that as maybe a lead, you might need to be able to, get a call in the middle of the night, and you might need to be, reaching out to someone to help out with a customer issue. Just make sure that you have all that documented. And if you are dependent on other teams, make sure that you work with all those leads so you have the access to them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of covered this a little bit, but how does Waters collaborate globally? Are there any major processes you use to make sure this is effective?
Yeah, I love this question actually. So we do spend a lot of effort educating everyone across the sites on how sort of different cultures impact the interactions in business. We have some trainings that are conducted again across all the sites. So we have 3 major sites. Have a site, our headquarters are in Massachusetts. We have a site in Romania. We have a site in the UK, and also we have vendors in different places. We have an office in India, in all those places, we sort of we train the folks. There are resources available for everyone to read and get trained on how different cultures in all those different places, how it impacts interactions, and how we need to be all aware of that when we go about sort of what we need to get done for the business. When we hire, we really hone on the collaborative skills. We're looking into that very, very closely. It makes a huge difference when having to work with teams that are distributed across the sites. Even though majority of our development teams are co-located, but we always have stakeholders that are in different sites. Some of the teams are distributed. I actually am an engineering manager sponsor for a team that has presence in 3 of the sites. There are some challenges associated with that, but we are able to work very, very well together. This is actually a very well formed and sort of gel team, even though it's only it's been formed about a year ago. we do include collaborative skills in our performance reviews. In order to reach a certain level within the organization, the team members need to be able to work effectively across the sites and across the teams as well. So we kind of look at it very seriously. We acknowledge that those skills can be developed and people can be educated on them, so we provide those opportunities as well. So I'm fairly new to Waters. I've been with Waters since July of the last year, so it's been a little over 6 or 7 months. I've been quite impressed with the level of attention that the company as a whole gives to that aspect of how to collaborate across the country's geographies and different cultures. So another thing that I could add to that is that we're definitely trying to make all the processes within sort of engineering organization consistent across the sites, and that from my perspective as an engineering manager, we work very hard to be aligned on how we measure the team's performance across the sites, how do we develop the engineering staff, and how we recruit. So and from the engineering team standpoint, the processes, for collaboration. So when teams need to interact with each other, they really need to be mindful of the time zone differences. So some teams that have those frequent interactions, they do need to adjust the hours. So if somebody has close interactions with the team in Romania, they're 7 hours away. They're not 10.5 hours away, like from the East Coast, let's say to Bangalore, Chennai. But nonetheless, 7 hours, there's a little bit of more overlap, but it's not a huge overlap. So those meetings will be starting early in the day. We encourage, use of cameras when people talk face to face. Sometimes when it's a large group meeting and everybody's reviewing a document, you don't really have to do in video. It's going to just sort of maybe take a toll on the bandwidth. But if it's sort of smaller group, it helps to see, like you were saying that earlier, it helps to see the sort of the feedback and the sort of facial expression.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's sort of in a nutshell.
Yeah. And there's actually so we got a comment from Sarah who says they have 2 to 3 hours of common office hours for collaboration between 2 time zones. So they intentionally only schedule full team meetings during that time frame. I think that's a very, 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 very good point. Our mornings are full usually for interactions with the teams in other time zones. And the other thing that I want to add is I try for the teams that are, on a different continent, I try not to schedule meetings for Friday. It's their afternoon. We don't want, our meetings to be scheduled for 4 p.m. on a Friday night for us. Wouldn't do that for them. I try not to schedule meetings for 8 a.m. on Monday as well for the teams here. Just sort of common courtesy, be respectful to everyone, across. So just, Yeah. So that actually leads in really nicely to our next question. I don't want to cut you off though. So our next question is about handling the merging of different cultures on a technical team. Is there any tips or tricks you have for this?
Yeah. So, and that's, again, an interesting question. And, we, in every team, even if it's co-located, you would have very different cultures. Everybody comes from a different background. Everybody has their own style. Everyone is different. Everyone is human. So it's so there are different ways to do that, and we sort of all establish relationships and sort of trust in different ways. I think everybody needs to remember that. Sometimes you know, in our teams in the US, we get straight to business, which I really, which I really appreciate. But it's okay to have a chit chat, especially with the teams that are far away, that you never see, that you don't ever sort of are in the same room together, you never share a meal with them. It's okay to have a chit chat. It's okay to ask, how is the weather? It's okay to ask, you know, what have you done over the weekend? You know, because we don't have those sort of opportunities to sort of meet in a break room while we're getting a cup of coffee. So I think I think those are important. So you cannot really sort of force the relationship. You kind of have to give it a little bit of time. You have to remember that people don't have to agree on everything, but it's important for everyone to understand each other, to understand where people are coming from, where the disagreement comes from, which sort of probably is true for people that are coming from the same culture as well. But I think it's very important when we have people that come from sort of, you know, very different backgrounds, and things might mean different things to them. So, you know, some people are always fashionably late. Some people are very punctual and get offended if somebody is, you know, a minute late for a call. But, you know, somehow need to figure out that it's not a disrespect. It's just sort of talk through that. I think talking through those things is really helpful. And again, you know, listening and understanding. So I think that's very, very important. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. You know, you don't want to force relationships, but I think by leaving that space for them to develop and not having that, if you leave people that extra little bit of buffer where they know that it's okay to, like, how's it going? How's the weather where you are? How was your day? Like, whatever. You're right. I mean, that's something that, having been immersed in US culture, that's something I'm used to. But, you know, somebody from another time zone or another area of the world might not, you know, have that same understanding. I think that's a good point. I mean, our teams, we do it, we have like a team-wide or a company-wide rule that you try and get to meetings 2 minutes early, and you schedule them so that they end 5 minutes before, you know, before the hour or the half hour, kind of to build in that buffer for a little bit of chit chat, whatever. But it also kind of gives you that buffer, so that way if, like, something runs over because it's important, you're not going to make yourself late to the next meeting.
Yeah, and one thing that I find very sort of helpful is at times, you know, especially, and that's true for folks that sort of sit next to each other, or that, you know, that sit apart. A lot of times, you know, the emails and the chat, you know, could be ambiguous, could lead to so many misunderstandings. You know, I always tell the teams, you know, sometimes folks complain about, you know, how things are, you know, unraveling, so to speak. Pick up the phone, you know, talk through it, and I find it always to be helpful.
Absolutely,
and yeah, so that's sometimes, you know, there are a lot of misunderstandings that happen over chats or in the email, and usually my rule of thumb is, if it's a third email on the topic, just pick up the phone, call, you know, and so.
That's a good rule of thumb, absolutely.
It's also the trick of just assume the best, assume they didn't mean to slam you.
And that can actually be like a really good kind of a good tip for helping to, like, short circuit problems like that. Because if you know, there's always going to be somebody that responds in a way that, you know, in your heart they meant to be kind of rude about it. But by calling it out and saying, like, I'm sure you didn't mean this the way it sounded, you pigeonhole them into that place where you have assumed that they are being nice. You've told them that you assume that they're being nice. And so now they're like, well, if I'm not nice, it's really obvious that I mean to not be nice.
Yes, and you're bringing up a very good point, Meg, and that's another important thing. And again, it could be applicable to, you know, for people that are coming from similar backgrounds or different backgrounds. Always give people benefit of a doubt. You know, have a sort of a positive regard. Assume that they sort of trying do well, know what they're doing, and sort of, I think if that's the mindset, I think things would be easier for everyone.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Our next question we've touched on a little bit before, but this person wants to know, do you recommend forcing video meetings or allowing voice only?
I don't recommend forcing anything. I think some people are, if somebody is not comfortable with the video, I think that's perfectly fine. If people are comfortable with the camera, I think that's great. Sometimes, and that's the consideration that every group needs to decide. Sometimes there might be a toll on the bandwidth for the network. Sometimes with the video calls are not going as good depending on how many people are joining. So I would say that if one wants everyone to be on the camera, there should be some sort of a consensus. But I think if teams never meet in person, then I think for one-on-ones, it's really helpful to have some sort of video once in a while, if that's possible. But I think it could be helpful, but definitely not something that needs to be pushed.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like an odd mix of like practical logistics of like bandwidth just might not permit it, but then like that you want people to be engaged. You don't want them to feel confronted oddly about it. Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of those situations that like it sucks to say like, well, it depends, but it kind of just depends.
It does.
This person wants to know, what are some free tools that can support supervision of a distributed team?
That was an interesting question. So I guess, and I could interpret it in different ways. So I'm gonna, I would say that for sort of leading or managing the distributed teams, I would say that you would probably use very similar tooling that you would use for co-located teams. So the tooling for that is not different. If the question refers to sort of possible performance issue, to sort of know better, if folks are doing what they're expected to do, I think if there is a performance issue, then it's going to surface, fairly quickly. Similarly to, the folks that are, within the same group that is co-located. As a manager, I would recommend to have very sort of close line of communication. To have, I recommend weekly one-on-ones. Sometimes it's not possible. However, I think that is very helpful to sort of, make sure that you have this line of communication. If there is a large distributed team that you're working with, I actually recommend to have daily meetings with the leads. That works. It could be a big challenge, especially if you are trying to sort of collaborate with a very large team that is either everyone is distributed or it's sort of present elsewhere. Obviously, if you cannot have one-on-ones with sort of that many people, I recommend to have the leads there on a daily, in a daily conversation to make sure what are the challenges, how they, if they need help, how we can help, and sort of to try and move things along to make sure that that everything goes as expected.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we use Asana for most of our like team tracking, like internally. But I mean, it could even be something as simple as just a basic Google Doc that's shared between the two parties. I mean, that way, like, we even use a format that's like your work done, your work to do, and then any blockers you have. And so if you're limited to like, 3 numbers and you got to nest your bullet points under that of what you're doing, it kind of helps to make everything a little bit quicker, and it also helps for escalation purposes because I can keep, going back to that doc and crossing things off as I get them done or deleting them or whatever, but I can also leave questions in there for my boss. So like when we have our one-on-ones once a week, I can drop things in there as I think of it. If I solve it later on, I can always take it off, but that way my boss can see the same doc. And so if she's got time to answer the question, great. And if not, we get it answered in our one-on-ones.
And that's a good point, Ned. And, I think it sort of depends on the scale and the complexity of the work that is being done. So, for example, if you are sort of a stakeholder with one of the teams and the team is sort of elsewhere, you could sort of have, once a week sync or check-in, with some other stakeholders, and use, like you said, Google Doc or any other sort of collaborative way to capture the notes that is sort of running. So that's, have done that in the past as well. If it's something that is complex and requires a lot of attention, I think that, I would highly recommend to have sort of daily check-in. Or any way to do a daily check, if a daily check-in, on the phone is absolutely impossible, then there has to be some sort of, but there has to be an acknowledgement and a handshake. I call it eye contact and a handshake. If the phone conversation is impossible, then sort of check in that, whatever communication you were trying to sort of make to others, that it's acknowledged, received, and understood. So
yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so this next question is a little bit more broad. How can you effectively coach team members with a wide range of experiences and competencies while keeping cultural differences in mind?
So, so that's also a very big topic, I think. And I can, from my experience, there were a couple techniques that I found to be very useful. And, I can sort of just refer to them, and perhaps, if you're interested, you can sort of move this up and sort of find more information on it. So I had an opportunity to go through training and workshop for inside out coaching. And I found it extremely helpful. And that sort of technique could be very effective for getting feedback from folks on any level, and for seeking feedback for yourself as well. And I found it extremely, I found it very effective, especially sometimes, especially if you are in a leadership role. You cannot be an expert in everything, but somehow you have to give advice or be helpful to folks that report to you or you work with. And that could be very tricky when you are not an expert. So if a person comes to advice and they clearly know better than you are about the subject, how do you direct them? How do you help them to sort of make the right decision? And so I found this technique very effective. So that's one. There's also a concept of situational leadership that I also found very, that could be very effective as well, that helps with, it could help you as a leader to help others on your team, especially if sort of, if you see a difference in performance, or how do you challenge them, or how do you provide guidance. So that's also helpful for different situations for folks on different levels, or even if you have somebody that is a subject matter expert, but suddenly they need somebody sort of reassurance. So that's been helpful as well.
Thank you for sharing that. All right, so we're almost out of time here today. I just want to call out before we leave that Waters is hiring. Bella, can you speak to what positions you're currently sourcing for or anything like that?
Yeah. Let me just grab this one, the other one. Yes, so we have a number of positions that we are hiring for. They could be found on our career site at www.waters.com. I have few positions open for one of my teams. Actually, for two of my teams. And two of them are with the testing roles, and one is, sorry, excuse me, more of the DevOps role. But yeah, please take a look at our open positions and apply.
All right, so I see we're over on time here, so I just want to say thank you real quick to everyone who joined us today. I really, really appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us. And Bella, thank you so much for spending the afternoon and letting us pick your brain about how we can make these global multicultural teams much more effective.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you.
All right, have a great day, everyone. Stay safe and well, and we will hopefully see you back here sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.